Fear, anxiety and uncertainty continue to dominate the minds of many in the country's higher education sector. The lockdown will put strain on university finances and many plans will be shelved. Or for students, a shrinking economy, job losses and loss of income will impact even harder. The provision of well-designed, affordable student housing could hold the key to the future of higher learning in the country. To discuss how players in the sector can design student accommodation for the new normal, we're joined by John Schooling, the founder and MD at STAG African, a multi-dimensional green property development, student accommodation and renewable energy group. John, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to have this conversation.
Sure. John, what impact would you say COVID-19 lockdown has had on university students across the country in terms of both access to education and even from an emotional perspective?
I think it's been pretty devastating. One of the most important things about being at university, especially in your, in your graduate years, your first 3 years, is that there's a huge amount of learning that happens because you're in contact with fellow students. It's kind of that feeling of belonging to a community, which is known as the hidden context of learning. What that means is that you learn a lot from the fact that you're with fellow students, with fellow interests in the same community at the same time. And anticipate that approximately 68% of all education at university in actual fact happens outside of the classroom. So if you're not on campus, you're not in the company of your fellow students, it can have a devastating effect on your overall educational levels.
And would you say it's important for students to be able to live or have access to campus accommodation, especially from a South African context?
I think it is absolutely critical in every country throughout the entire world. It's been proven that students that are in well-designed on-campus education have an 80% less chance of dropping out in their first year, which is critically important. Also, our research has found that there's at least a 25% increase or improvement in the students' abilities to pass if they're on campus accommodation. Now, if you add to that the problem that they're no longer able to attend classes, and in addition to that, they're not on campus, they're perhaps living very far away, and very often with poor communication abilities or capacity, and I think that could be pretty devastating.
Sure. Well, take us into the impact that COVID-19 has had on your industry. How has the lockdown affected the university and student accommodation industry financially?
The universities themselves have taken a very bad knock. I know a lot of the universities have discounted the entire academic year from an accommodation perspective. A lot of the private sector providers of student accommodation are really struggling, especially those that weren't reliant on NSFAS. NSFAS has fortunately continued paying, but a lot of the private students who are not reliant on NSFAS are saying no stay, no pay, which means that they're not paying for their accommodation or want big discounts. I know of some of the private sector providers of student accommodation that are taking a 50% discount or allowing a 50% discount, and in some cases they are being forced to accept a 100% discount.
And what do you make of that, that notion of no pay, no stay, in a time when we're dealing with a pandemic and many of the students, simply cannot afford to stay on campus during this time?
It is actually, it has been very devastating for everyone, and I do believe a lot of the private sector accommodation providers are very sympathetic towards the students. I think we all understand that this is completely unprecedented. I don't think in the history of mankind have we ever experienced this kind of lockdown where the entire economy for a long time was actually locked down. A lot of parents who've got students at university are really struggling to make ends meet at the moment. You can imagine their own income has been slashed by quite a bit. So I think there's a general empathy amongst everyone saying that let's try and work together, let's try and solve this problem together. But it is having a devastating impact, especially on those providers of student accommodation who rely on the individual student to pay their rental every month. I'm not sure what the solution is. I just know that there's going to be a lot of give and take. The providers of student accommodation are very often geared up, and they have to go and approach their banks and say, look, this is the situation. Can we have an extension of the bond repayment period? I think that's a general consensus where everyone's really trying to work together to solve this problem.
Sure. John, one of the major stories we're covering this afternoon is on the new school calendar, and the statement that's been released by the Higher Education Department. I mean, the results for the matrics of 2020, those are only expected out late in February. How do you see this affecting the intake of matric learners to higher education institutions, and not just the institution, but also dealing with accommodation as well?
Yes, I've heard of only 2 universities so far that are going to be able to finish the academic year by the end of this year. I think some of them might be extending into January, February next year. A lot of universities' intake is determined by results in the old days in September, which is the pre-final mark, and also the grade 11 mark. So I believe that they will still be able to start the academic year next year, but it's going to place incredible pressure on the institutions. They're going to have to release the holiday times, I reckon, the June holiday from the current 1 month or 3 weeks. They might have to reduce that to 10 days. So they're going to have to consolidate the entire year. They might have to start a little bit later in, let's say, February, March, or March rather than February. And that means that they're going to have to almost compact the entire year. And instead of extending up to November, they're going to have to try and still get it to November, but by compacting the entire year because they're starting so much later.
Sure.
I think as far as the accommodation sector is going to be concerned, I think there's going to be quite a bit of disruption. I'm sincerely hoping that a lot of the student accommodation providers in the private sector are going to be able to survive this lockdown. I trust they are going to be able to survive. So if they can, then it's not going to be too devastating. We have got a shortfall of between 300,000 and 400,000 beds in South Africa at the moment. A large portion of the student accommodation is provided by the private sector, and I sincerely hope that they are going to be able to survive this lockdown.
Of course, we don't know how long COVID-19 is here to stay. It's been called the new normal, John, and I mean, with many students, we're seeing more and more students going back to campus. What provisions has STAG made to ensure that the accommodation is, environmentally friendly, but also takes into consideration the fact that we are dealing with a pandemic and we don't know how long it'll be here for?
We also got to get used to another dynamic, and that is that this might be the new ongoing crisis. Year in and year out, we might start experiencing, for whatever reason, we might start experiencing new COVID viruses every 2 years. So I think we're going to have to adapt very, very quickly to this new reality, and that is to say, if we're going to live in a COVID world, we're going to have to adapt the way that we work and the way that we interact. And fortunately, the unintended consequences of good design, and we've been promoting good design and innovative building technology for the last 12 years for the sector, and we have found that, it was almost coincidental and very, very fortunate, maybe a lot of luck, but the design criteria that we've been following, where every single student lives in a home, in other words, in an 8-bedroom pod, where they have their own accommodation, where access is limited to the 8 of them in their home. They have their own private showers, toilets, ablution facilities. They have their own cooking facilities. It's almost as if each of the 8 apartments or 8-bed pods is a self-sustained unit. So should a virus break out amongst any one of those 8 students, they're going to be able to lock down in that 8-bed pod rather than closing down the entire residence. The traditional way of designing student accommodation in the past was where you had up to 100 people living on, say, a single floor. Should COVID break out in that particular instance, the closure of that entire residence would be quite devastating. We're also now introducing an additional idea, and that is that in every single one of the residences that we're building, we're suggesting that we build an isolation area of maybe 8 beds, and also have facilities available for possibly a nursing staff member to be able to occupy. And in the event of a lockdown, should isolation be necessary, those who do test positive can move into their own rooms in the isolation pod. And the nurse that is then hence employed to look after their interests can also have her own apartment. So the entire unit becomes isolated.
And would this mean then that was likely to see the price of staying at a residence increase? Should that be implemented?
Yes. Theoretically, yes. Building costs tend to continuously go up every year. We are trying to redefine that dynamic where we are saying that just like technology has caused IT items, like, for example, computers once upon a time cost millions and millions of rand, with very little capacity. Technology and innovation have allowed those to become better, faster, quicker with greater memory, yet cost a huge amount less. We're saying that we want to introduce that concept into the building industry, where we want to use innovation and technology in order to drive the price down, in actual fact, rather than allowing it to drift up. We're no longer willing to accept that construction costs should increase every single year. We want to see innovation bringing the cost down rather than letting it go up. We're in the process of working, we're probably about 3 weeks away from developing a new kind of technology that we're hoping will reduce the construction cost of student beds by at least 60%.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you for that. We'll leave it there this afternoon. John Schooling, the founder and MD of STAG African, a story we'll be tracking for you and keeping an eye on as it progresses.